Welcome to this Wise Words academic seminar hosted by the Contemplative Studies Center at the University of Melbourne. I'm Associate Professor Nicholas Van Dam, Director of the Center. We'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners of the unceded land in which we work, learn, and live, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung, and Budurong peoples. We pay respect to elders past and present, and to any Indigenous peoples joining us today. Today, we have the great privilege to be joined by Dr. Michael Yellowbird, Professor and Dean of the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba in Canada. Michael is an enrolled member of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara, or MHA Nation in North Dakota in the United States. And he's a member of the International Mindfulness Teachers Association, a certified mindfulness teacher, professional, and has been practicing mindfulness meditation for more than 47 years. His mindfulness and neurodecolonisation work is featured in numerous mind-body and mindfulness podcasts, magazines, and newspaper articles. In today's presentation, he's going to explore the effects of chronic stress, trauma, and colonisation on Indigenous minds and bodies. He will highlight traditional Indigenous contemplative practices, their effects on the brain and body as observed through Western science, and how these practices can foster resilience and coping mechanisms. If you do have questions as you're listening to Michael present, please post them in the Q&A at any point that you have those questions, and we'll get to those questions at the end of Michael's talk, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So Michael, thank you for joining us, and I will hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Nicholas. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. I also want to acknowledge, the territory that I'm on. I'm in Treaty 1 territory in Canada. I'm actually from the United States. So the Treaty 1 territory is the land of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, Ojibwe, the Dakota peoples, and the Dene, as well as the Métis people. So I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm in someone else's territory. So it's a pleasure for me to be here today to kind of present some of the work that I've been doing, and happy to get started right away on my presentation. So I guess just jump into it. I've got a number of slides, and we're going to kind of sift through those quickly. This is a presentation I've been doing, and I did it in San Diego at a International Society for Contemplative Research conference. These are two of my daughters, my oldest and my second youngest, meditating. And in my presentation, I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about colonization, decolonization, and what I call neurodecolonisation a bit, as also call it mindful decolonization. And ask these questions: what happens to a traumatized, colonized mind and body, and how can we explore the mind and body parts that are changed, by Indigenous contemplative practices? This happens to be one of my grandfathers. His name was Sitting Bear, so a very well-known chief in our part of the territory. Okay, well, you've probably all had a primer 101 on colonization, but these are some of the things that I think are really important to kind of remember, that colonization, of any group is this unwelcome intrusion phase, right? Folks come into your territory, and interactions between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people often turn toxic and harmful, and have these interactions that lead to cultures being overwhelmed, and sickness and decay and death setting in. The last part of my model here, those that survive the first three stages of colonization, that become colonized, the ideas, the beliefs and values and practices become part of their lives and how they begin to identify. They can function in colonial society, but for many different reasons remain vulnerable to the structures and processes of colonialism. I'll talk about some of the reasons why that is from my work. In the United States, a colleague, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, wrote a book about Indigenous peoples' history of the United States. And her look at, settler colonialism was that, beginning at the colonial period to the founding of the United States, all the way through the 20th century, she's documented as a historian torture, terror, sexual abuse, massacres, all these different kinds of occupations and removals that, happen. And of course, forced removal of Native children to boarding schools, and the policies of termination have been a really huge, part of the history of Indigenous people after contact. You may or may not know that in part of the subjugation of Indigenous people in this part of the world started with what they call the doctrine of discovery, the papal bull, where after Columbus's so-called discovery, Pope Alexander VI, called for these barbarous nations, talking about these Indigenous people here, to be subjugated and brought to the Catholic faith and Christian religion for the propagation of the Christian empire. And this last bullet point is still law in the United States. If a Christian enters the lands of non-Indigenous people, their lands become the possession of the discoverers, because there were court cases that determined Indigenous people could not own the land. They could occupy it, but they were not owners of the land. It's also in one of the most sacred documents of the United States, the Declaration of Independence from England and King George. So if you scan through this real sacred document, you find that it mentions the merciless Indian savages whose only known rule of warfare was indiscriminate killing, and so on. And Indigenous people are the only people that are mentioned in the U.S. Declaration of Independence. You may or may not have seen this picture here, but this is a picture of what is known as American Progress, the Manifest Destiny. And the woman in this picture is called Columbia. And it was painted by an artist named John Gast in 1872. So if you look closely at the picture, you'll see these different kinds of things happening in the picture. And it was done for a travel log to get settlers and Europeans to move westward in the United States to kind of begin occupying all the Indigenous lands and territories. So if you look at Columbia in the centerpiece, you'll see that she has this very light skin, blonde hair. If you look at it closer, she's got blue eyes. And if you look close to the top of her head, she's got a star on the top of her head, like a headband, which is called the Star of the Empire, right? And this was the empire building that was going on. She's moving forward. And if you can see behind her, this picture doesn't really show it real well, but behind her is all light, and she's moving, chasing away the darkness, right? And then you see the trains behind her, the stagecoaches, the men at the bottom who are beginning to kind of toil the soil and sort of, clear cut and plow through prairies, and of course change the geography of the lands. In front of them, you see miners moving along with their shovels and their picks and those kinds of things, one on horseback. And these are the miners that ended up in California that committed a major genocide on California Indigenous people. What's interesting about this picture is if you look at the very bottom of the picture on the left-hand side, you'll see a big bear. And that big bear is a grizzly bear. If you look up on top of that grizzly bear, you'll see running beside the horses and the people on the horses is a wolf. And then you see the Indigenous people, the so-called American Indians. And above them, you see the buffalo running across the plains. So it's interesting to remember that the grizzly, the wolf, the buffalo, and Indigenous people were almost completely exterminated in the United States. And probably in the contiguous United States, there were maybe 10 million or more Indigenous people. By the late 1700s, there were 240,000 left. And most of that was from warfare, slavery, indiscriminate killing and genocide, and who knows what else. So this is the progress, right? That's kind of etched in the minds of people back in that time, that they're going to settle. This was God's, direction, of course, to manifest, to the destiny was to kind of take over the rest of the country. Sometimes you can see Columbia in more modern pictures that you see, and this is Columbia yet here, holding this light, right? So you see the time periods. The 19th century colonization, of course, a lot of trauma was from that as well. Different interior secretaries of what they call Indian Affairs ordered the end to all these dances and ceremonies, due to their hindrance on civilization. Any leaders that were practicing contemplative or spiritual practices who were caught doing this by the authorities were, the so-called authorities, were ordered up to 6 months in prison, and those who repeatedly, participated, could be shipped out somewhere else and moved from the community completely. This is, I think, typical of what's happened in Australia and Canada and the United States and other parts of the world, where Indigenous people and Indigenous children were taken from their homes, put in these boarding schools, these residential schools, and forced to assimilate. And it was really one way to guarantee that these generations would not remember their traditional healing practices, their contemplative practices, and they would lose their identity. So it took until about 1978 for the American Indian Religious Freedom Act to be passed, where traditional American Indian ceremonies intruded upon and interfered with and banned. The United States and the House of in the U.S., the Senate and the House of Representatives passed a law that they wanted to preserve American Indian religions and their ability to practice their their belief system and so on. And the last couple lines there, have access to sites, use the possession of sacred objects, and the freedom to worship through ceremonies and traditional rites. So all part of their contemplative history. The slides left out is that probably 70% or more of that land where Indigenous people had traditional sacred ceremonies are all occupied and bought out by corporations and private individuals. Some of it is federal lands where Indigenous people can go, but most of the people don't have any access to these traditional ceremonial and traditional sites. So the law, didn't really do what it was supposed to do. So what are the continuing effects of colonialism? Of course, because of all that, we still have intergenerational trauma and post-traumatic stress. Because Indigenous people are mismatched to settler society in our part of the world, mood disorders and substance abuse, happen because folks were not, matched, for the things that are happening in society. In fact, most people aren't really matched well for what's happening in first world, industrial societies because of chronic, proof of that is chronic diseases, chronic disorders, large rates of cancer, violence, and all those kinds of things. So it's not just Indigenous people. A lot of health disparities, though, as I mentioned, chronic diseases, a lot of suicides, very high among some groups, yet incarceration is extremely high among some groups. A lot of hate crimes are committed, and of course, as I mentioned, mismatch, that Indigenous people, the way Indigenous people's cultures evolved, didn't evolve to live in urban societies. They evolved to be on the lands, in the forests, in the mountains, by the waters, by the rivers, by the ocean, those kinds of things. And of course, most of that, is all private property now. So what happens then when, it's kind of been an interest to me, what happens at the molecular level when people go through these generations and generations and generations of trauma, right? I spent a lot of time looking at, part of my research looks at the effects of trauma from genes that are passed down. And the word that I call is molecular colonization, how you can be colonized at the molecular levels in the body. And plasticity, our body's ability to change and grow and shift and shape and that kind of stuff is trauma is also part of that plasticity, where it can rise and it can fall and get greater and get smaller depending upon the experiences that one has. Molecular colonization really then is about this traumatic decay that happens at this really small units that make up the organism. These very minute particles or molecula, that are due to chronic stress. And what I've been interested in is looking at different parts of the brain, how chronic stress and colonialism changes, us in many different ways. Now, this is a particular picture is about dendritic spines here. On the right side, you'll see the green spine running down, or the root running down with the little spines kind of reaching out. And you see how spinogenesis happens, through learning and through memory and through, activities and sensory experiences and so on. And as you go along, you see some of these that are pruned. And of course, if we would say that, this child here that was born here heard language, in utero or right after they were born, in adolescence they heard language, but when the language was banned, for example, on the early adulthood, if you can see where my pointer is, that dendritic spine was eliminated. So that person may not have that capacity to speak language. And it could be anything. It could be empathy. It could be all kinds of different kinds of things that are based on sensory experiences and learning. What we do know is that when the body is under chronic stress, and a lot of us are under chronic stress because we live in first world countries where there's a lot of, lots of things to be stressed about. But you compound that with genetics that have come from populations that have been very, very oppressed and marginalized and so on. We realize that these chronic stress chemicals, like these protein kinase C, flood the brain. This enzyme floods the brain and it breaks down these delicate dendritic spines in our neurons in our front of the brain, prefrontal cortex. And when that happens, our learning begins to suffer. Our memory begins to suffer. Our sense, it's like we start to experience a huge change, at that molecular level. We know there are gender differences in the way the spines increase or decrease, but we know now too that what's really interesting to me, as I've looked at the research, is dendritic spines. The more you have, the better. It means you're in a rich environment, right? And Indigenous people, it's pretty clear that they had very rich environments moving across the land, tasting different foods, having to know what, the weather, the sun, remember where, different things were, and all this kind of information constantly sort of floating through in this memory, doing this work and doing a lot of critical analytical thinking as they moved along, the landscape, climbing over mountains, over hills, or going across waters, watching out for danger, those kinds of things. So that's kind of what most of the current evolutionary biology says, is that, if you're a runner, for instance, it's good to move, right? That you're running inside on a treadmill is better, but the best you can do is, walking out in the neighborhood. What's even better, though, is to walk out in the wild forest where you have to duck under trees, smell different smells and so on, because the brain is this holistic sort of integrated system where it's doing all that work all the time. So what we know is that when people are stressed, the dendritic spines that break because of all this chronic stress, and as I said, it could be historical and contemporary, then we're more subject to dementias and Alzheimer's disease. Interestingly enough, I finished a book chapter this past year. I think it's out now in press, in a book about Indigenous peoples' health, that the rate of dementia and Alzheimer's disease was climbing exponentially among Indigenous people in North America, which is interesting because a lot of people say that part of the reason is because Indigenous people may have this APOE4 gene, which makes us vulnerable to Alzheimer's disease. However, there are other populations, hunter-gatherer populations still today, that have this particular gene that don't suffer from Alzheimer's the way that we do in the first world, right? So again, I'll move on from there. Also, kind of at this molecular level, I call it the molecular colonization, is that, telomere, and the telomere at the end of the chromosomes. And the telomere, we live a long, healthy life, but every time a cell divides, the telomeres become slightly shorter. Eventually, they become so short that the cells can no longer divide successfully. The cell dies, and the cells become senescent in the body. And that senescence of the cell in the body that's just floating there from that happens, as we age. But again, under chronic stress, under chronic, colonization, and that oppression and anxiety and that ruminating about all that sort of stuff actually shortens telomeres even quicker, leading us to chronic diseases and a lower life expectancy. So in molecular colonization, I've looked at these studies too, and I've been reading some of the research. I haven't looked at, the more recent stuff, but we know that, in some of the physical activity, people who have physical activity of higher aerobic capacities, but also longer telomeres, which would tell me that, back in the day when our people were moving and being out a lot, they probably had longer telomeres, which protected them from the diseases of aging, from Alzheimer's, from depression, from anxiety, from those different kinds of, diabetes, some of those things that are novel diseases. The study says, they're similar to people that are younger than they are. And again, in this book chapter I wrote about is that movement is life. Movement is, a decolonization movement is so important to us as Indigenous people. We also know that the power of oppression, I guess, the power of colonialism. In this particular study, telomere lengths were shortest for both depressed and healthy participants who were showing signs of chronic stress. Think about it. People that work out and stuff, if you've still got a lot of chronic stress in your life, hate crimes committed against you, you feel like you're victimized or you are victimized, and you're dealing with a lot of oppression in the community, you're seeing relatives passing away, seeing a lot of violence, but yet you're still working out, you're still, the telomeres are still going to shorten because of the chronic stress. And it's going to be similar, probably better than depressed folks, but very similar. And of course, the depressed people, if you're healthy and depressed, or just depressed, it's going to speed up, the shortening of the telomeres, and of course, disturb, cortisol. And you have that dysregulation, of course, when cortisol, is that kind of fight flight chemical, right? Stay alert. When that chemical becomes dysregulated, then we're in this constant state of fear, hypervigilance, and so on. And that happens to a lot of folks that have been stressed, suffering from depression, shortened telomeres, and of course, with the colonialism and things that come with it. We know this is very true about kids too as well. This is something that I think is so important to think about, is that what about the length of the telomeres in kids, right? So we know from the research is that stressful homes, are highly associated with shortened telomeres, but also encode these neurotransmitters like norepinephrine and cortisol, which like kids are, again, hypervigilant, something's going to happen, right? So they're watching out for the danger. High rates of mortality, high rates of violence, neglect, isolation, all those things can really, really begin to raise those and encode those certain neurotransmitters, which of course heighten the effect of stress, which then of course shortens telomeres even quicker. So when we look at, this should be a no-brainer by now, children living in the most loving homes have longer telomeres. It's a good thing. They're going to live longer. They're going to have less of the diseases, of kids that live in stressful environments. In this particular study, had telomeres that were 40% shorter than those kids who were living in the most nurturing settings. So think about that. Kids that we can't see what's happening at that molecular level unless we actually go in and do a test on them and take a blood test and look at the length of the telomeres in kids. We think, we're doing all this work with kids. It's good work, and I'm sure it is, but we just don't know until we really take a look deep into the molecular colonization, of kids to find out if their telomeres are much shorter, and this particular study, of course, says, yes, that's true. So in a sense, then, those kids are going to end up with the diseases of aging much sooner. Heart disease, cancers, diabetes, all these other metabolic diseases, obesity, and so on, and a much lower rate of a much less level of life expectancy. So think about that for a second. I think about that a lot, and think about how this information needs to get out to more folks. Same thing. Moms can pass on shorter telomeres to their kids. I did my DNA analysis, gosh, maybe about 5 years ago, and I did my mom's, and I looked at my mom's, and I saw how many shortened telomeres she had passed on to me as a kid. And it was interesting to see that, because the life factors that that women experience, like my mother experienced when she was growing up, going to a boarding school and, you know, suffering from poverty and these different kinds of things. And of course, violence in the home shortened her telomeres, right? And she passed those on to myself and probably some of my brothers and sisters too, as well. So there's a lot of life factors that shorten, you know, those telomeres. Hate crimes. In here, there's a lot of but not enough focus on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. A lot of abuse, poverty, isolation, violence, and so on. Sex trafficking, all the way down to, you know, these tropes or memes, you know, of hate that are kind of fading away. Hopefully more than they have been. And that didn't really start to kind of take root until George Floyd was murdered in 2020. Then people started to kind of take on some of these really, you know, awful kinds of hate, you know, symbols and so on. But that you know, moms can pass those on to baby. That's how close relationship is. So a lot of times they say babies are born biologically older because their telomeres are shortened. So what about decolonization? The model that I use is three circles, you know, that sort of intersect. There's stripping away of these harmful invasive thoughts during the cleansing period that are imposed colonizing structures, beliefs, and practices. There's the Renaissance period, which I sort of see that's going on now a lot with folks that are going back to cultural practices and restoring them and thinking and beliefs and values. And they're relevant and necessary for survival and well-being, especially in this time when we're not only in what they call, you know, global warming, but now global boiling, right? I have a lot of conversations with scholars and students and activists and that sort of thing. And people are kind of trying to kind of restore a lot of these cultural ways of being. The Enlightenment period is the final stage of decolonization, where we begin to birth and use new ideas, thinking, technologies, and lifestyles, and so on. Like I've been asking this question with people, I've been studying it a bit. What does AI, you know, what does artificial intelligence mean to Indigenous people? Is it, you know, is it going to be all bad? Going to be all good? Is it going to be a combination of both? But how do we use that technology in order to kind of help, you know, advance and empower Indigenous people so it can't be used against us, right? So I mentioned evolutionary mismatch, you know, or the concept of the evolutionary trap. We evolved with certain kinds of traits, you know, that were once advantageous to us, you know, in our past, where we walked a lot, we moved a lot, or we did certain kinds of things. But because of changes in the environment, we don't do that anymore. They haven't become maladaptive, but this environment has become, I guess, maladaptive, right? It's an environment that doesn't support some of those traditional contemplative practices or lifestyles and so on. In my own work, I do Indigenous as well as decolonization, mindful decolonization practices, and the cleansing part. Practices that encourage an inventory of one's thoughts and beliefs and how they are shaped by colonialism. So we sit and we kind of think about that. The practices then help create a safe and secure place for someone who's cleansing from colonialism, helps build a sense of triumph over colonialism, encourages a mindful confrontation of colonialism, that we really begin to see it clearly as we give ourselves a chance to kind of, you know, bring it into our awareness and look at it for what it is and how to confront it. The Renaissance is, you know, something I'd mentioned earlier, but it's about how do we begin to, you know, revive traditional contemporary spiritual songs, dances, prayers, symbols, ceremonies, and so on, and prophecies of Indigenous communities, not just for the weekend, not just for a conference, not just for, you know, whatever, but how do we get people to engage in these all the time, right? Every day, singing, dancing, prayer, ceremonies, very critical. And the Enlightenment, you know, again, as I said, you know, how do we use those things, you know, like you know, AI technologies or the Zoom technology or these kinds of technologies in order to kind of advance, you know, the well-being of all humans and all sentient beings. Let me go to neurodecolonisation. So some of the work that I've done really focuses on these 11 traditional contemplative practices. I'm not going to talk about them all. I'll talk about a few of them, but running, dancing, and singing, you know, we're meant to move, we're meant to dance, meant to sing. sleep so important, laughter and humor, collectivism, all the way down to being outside. So these kinds of things increase longevity, and they also improve our genetic expression. So if we look at movement, for example, we know that we evolved to run and move. I think many of you, when you're part of the world, would be very familiar with the studies that happened when they sent some Indigenous folks out to the outback and lived out there for a while, how their diabetes changed, their obesity changed, and their overall general health got better. And this is true about a lot of Indigenous people. If we move and we run, we get our heart rates up, it improves our physical health, mental health, our brain's working, memory and processing speed. That research has all been done. In particular, it improves our brain's executive function, delays our ability to delay gratification, like we used to do. We've got actually genes for that, that help us delay gratification, avoid distraction, improve cognitive flexibility, our ability to move from one cognitive task to the next. Something that's really critical that, I guess we don't talk enough about is our brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, like miracle grow for the brain. So when we are, eating traditional diets and exercising and doing those kinds of things, those levels rise. And what's important about that is that when our BDNF levels are going up, it protects our brain. It actually creates neurogenesis. We grow more brain cells, and it protects our existing brain cells. That's very critical for people who are under a great deal of stress and oppression. And there's a protective factor there against things like deterioration of the brain that leads to Alzheimer's and dementias. Some of the more recent studies, it's 2016, but it's getting a little dated, but to me, it's still a pretty new study, was that we know that regular endurance exercise, getting your heart rate and moving for long distances like Indigenous people did in the past, causes these really important adaptations in what they call kynurenine expression, or the metabolism, that really protects us by increasing what they call CAT, this kynurenine aminotransferase, right? It increases that, right? We know that now from the skeletal muscle and the expression. And we know that when we sit, we don't move, especially Indigenous people that are close to that, genetically close to those times, that we know that we develop this neurotoxic kynurenine, right? But as we move, as we do this endurance exercise, it begins to change and neutralize the neurotoxic kynurenine to the production of kynuretic acid. We've got all these protective factors here. So when you're working with Indigenous folks, right, here's some evidence that, shows that maybe running, maybe movement and those kinds of things are probably the most powerful pill that you have in the toolbox to help deal with anxiety and depression disorders. So this is BDNF, promotes neuron growth and stops neurons from dying. How do we improve BDNF? Well, first of all, what does it do? It improves long-term memory, higher order thinking, higher order learning. It's helps protect the brain and helps it develop new connections, repairs failing brain cells, and protects healthy brain cells. How do we do that? Well, this is old Navajo grandma there. She's probably about 86 years old, out in the race. She's got her Nikes on, or whatever, maybe her whatever shoes she's got on. She's moving along, but very traditional, right? For even old people to be out there back in the day. Now, we don't look at it that way because we don't have the same value for elders as we did, back in that day when elders, weren't frail and weren't riddled by diseases like diabetes and cancers and hypertension and so on. So increasing BDNF, again, these are all very traditional things, I think, that, for Indigenous people, like exercise, avoiding sugar, right? We didn't have sugar. We rarely had sugar in our population. So every once in a while we'd run across some berries or a beehive or something. Fasting, which was an everyday event for many Indigenous people, intermittent fasting, mental stimulation. I mentioned earlier, walking through the lands, going up and down hills, crossing streams and so on. It's all part of the mental stimulation. Sleep, eating fatty fish or getting omega-3 fatty acids. There are anti-inflammatory foods. There are mild bioenergetic hormetic stress things that people did, cold showers, hot saunas, or being in hot weather, all those things cause, hormetic stress, which of course that doesn't kill you, makes you stronger. Mindfulness, meditation, of course, probiotic foods. So dancing, right? So again, these are all, this running, all these things are all part of a contemplative, world that I think are all part of us. People thought about these things as they did them. Dancing is really, again, one of those important things, in singing, right? So in this particular study, it shows that singing, increases these different endocannabinoids in the brain, right? And dancing, improves the mood, right? And cycling on a bike, of course, another set of endocannabinoids, positive effects, right? Singing, the most powerful beneficial activity, which is, what we used to do all the time as Indigenous people, sing at all these different occasions, right? And of course, not only does it raise your endocannabinoids, which are, improving mood and reducing stress and anxiety, enhancing memory and protecting the brain, but also raises brain-derived neurotrophic factors, so your brain's protected. Again, think about it, how exponentially Alzheimer's disease and dementias are going up, and how now we have evidence that singing, traditional singing, dancing, running, those kinds of things, all are really critical for our health and well-being. Now, these dancers are out there, and the dances, a lot of times the dances they're doing are very contemplative dances. These are people from my tribe, Arikara tribe, and they're out there, they're singing these songs. And these are the Bear Society. They're singing to the bear, the power of the bear, and they're out there, they sing for hours. They sing for hours. And of course, they begin to transcend, their self here, and they begin to meet the spirit of the bear. And of course, they have very big dynamic experiences. You see this man over here, these are grizzly bear claws. So a lot of these things come to the singers, these different kinds of things. What about the influence of fragrances on our psychophysiology? We know now that it's probably one of the most important things that, sense of smell and sacred smells have a very, very powerful effect on the brain and activities and the EEG, right? So when we look at, how the olfactory stimulation can change our cognition, mood, and social behavior, then we understand why people have used smudge or sacred smells, when they do ceremony. I just read a study recently about how smelling fragrances at night, certain fragrances, like let's say I was burning cedar or sage or sweetgrass, something from over this part of the territory at night before I went to bed. I would smell that. The research is now showing that people sleep deeper. They go into, like a theta level of sleep, really deep dreaming sleep, and they find it easier to sleep. That in itself protects the brain from things like Alzheimer's and dementias, because the brain begins to relax and open up, and we've got our own sort of cleansing system that comes through the brain, and it goes out of the body and takes out, these different kinds of molecular junk and particles that build up in the brain, which is why sleep is so important. This is the musical brain, the songs that are sung, singing songs that are contemplative songs, that are sacred songs. It lights up the empathy circuits. Oxytocin begins to be secreted, especially if you're like those men that were just singing, those bear singers. They're singing together. It's pretty clear that their oxytocin levels are going up. Their cortisol levels begin to go down, as they sing, right? Especially if they're singing contemplative, sacred songs. Language structures, call and response, really is a very dynamic response when a lead singer will sing something in the language and the people respond back to them, right? And of course, the dopamine reward that happens and it drives this motivation, activates these language structures as well. And of course, when there's this music coming, that dopamine reward knows that there's going to be a happy song, a sacred song, and the people are going to be blessed by the song. The spirits are going to come. They're singing these songs, and it becomes to be a very, very powerful contemplative practice. These are Mandan Indians from my reservation, Indigenous people. I guess we still sometimes call ourselves the Indians. I grew up back in the day, so that's what they call us. And they're doing a buffalo dance. So they're kind of I shouldn't say they're kind of, but they are embodying the spirit of the buffalo. And they're making the movements. They're dancing for long periods of time. And of course, as I mentioned to you before, the dance is a contemplative dance, and they're moving. They're thinking about the spirit of the buffalo. They're calling in the spirits of the buffalo. They're trying to connect with one another. So their oxytocin levels are going up because they're dancing as a group. Their cortisol levels are going down. Their BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factors, going up, protecting their brain. Their telomeres, are being restored through this activity. So what we know from Western science is that dancing, of course, improves memory, attention, and focus. One particular study said a 10-month-long ballroom dancing class improved people's memory, who are having mild cognitive impairment, right? So again, these are, if you think about when I start talking about earlier about contemplative practices, about the medicine men who were jailed and the ceremonies that were being banned, dancing that was being, prohibited. These are all the things that were a big part of the contemplative world of Indigenous people that were banned, and people just don't do them much anymore, right? Yeah, Berglund says dance has been a universal aspect of the human experience for millennia, and is part of our collective DNA. Our bodies have evolved to dance in synchronized unison. Dancing on a regular basis seems to change the way we think and interact with one another. Let me kind of move on here because I need to get to some of these slides here. Now, this is one of our fellow tribesmen from the Arikara tribe, and he's in the Sacred Earth Lodge, and he's having this experience where he's doing what I call, object meditation, sacred object meditation. So he's looking at these objects, and he's embodying the objects. They're becoming part of who he is, and he knows about them. And he's, as he meditates on them, you see the baseline and the meditation shifts that happen. In the left side, you see the attention area, the left prefrontal cortex that isn't connected. As he gets deep into the meditation, the SPECT image would show that, there's a connection there, where it's connected, it's all red now in the front of the left side prefrontal cortex, this area here. We also see differences in the change in the occipital lobe, where the occipital lobe, here is kind of broken. Now it's fully connected. And if you could see it a little closer, that, it's a bit redder, that sort of thing, it's meaning there's more activity there. So what we know is that the left prefrontal cortex, when it's activated, it's associated with feelings of happiness, joy, optimism, a sense of well-being, right? And as this man is focusing on that, the occipital lobe, the seeing part of the brain, this part here is enabling him to see the songs, to see the people lighting the sacred, sage, the passing of these sacred pipes from generation to generation. Maybe even sees the earth where the pipes were taken, or the stems were gathered from in the trees, and the pipes that were taken from the earth, the blood of the earth, right? And how when the pipes were first joined, they joined human beings, with the cosmos, right? So this is what he's thinking about in terms of his contemplative life, right? It's not just like he's looking at these things, but he's got a whole history behind him. In this next one, it's these again, men from my tribe here. So these were both taken about 1904, 1903. This is an image that was done by Edward Curtis in a book called The Vanishing Indian. That all the Indigenous people were going to die off here. We almost did, but we made a comeback. So, but they sing to this sacred cedar tree, and as they sing to this tree, they call the tree mother. The tree is a female, presence to them, sentient being to them. It gives life. So they see as they sing to a mother. Sorry, there's a plane flying over right now where I'm at. So, as they do it longer and longer, we know that studies that have been done on Tibetan monks and nuns and other contemplatives show that when people get in this very deep transcendent state of doing that kind of sacred practice, the parietal lobe, see that, kind of goes offline and gets quiet on the right side of the slide here, or the brain here. The parietal lobe is significant because the parietal lobe, it really codes for what they call visual spatial reasoning. And once we sing and we engage in this for long, long periods of time, let's say up to 10,000 hours of meditative, contemplative time singing to this tree, we have this very deep transcendent experience where, our brain waves change. We go from our regular, beta waves, and alpha waves up to a gamma wave, and the brain's becoming maximally sensitive. And we're seeing things, hearing things, feeling things, experiencing things that we don't normally experience because the brain is so sensitive. And it goes offline, and pretty soon the visual spatial reasoning is offline. And then there's no distance between the tree, the mother, the grandmother, Atna Tawissa, and the men. They actually connect. They become one. The men become the fragrance of the tree, the roots of the tree, the bark of the tree. The tree becomes them, right? We know that now because these research studies, have been done enough to kind of show Western sciences saying, yes, this is probably what's happening here. And again, it's very traditional, where people found sacred sites, sacred trees, sacred waters, those kinds of things, and spent their time. And remember the power of singing. What singing does, right? Raises our endocannabinoids, our BDNF, and aside from all those other things. So this is what Andrew Newberg says, and these are a duck society in my tribe again. These are dancers, and these are Arikara people, Indigenous people. These are my tribe, my father and mother's tribe. So what I was talking about, the studies, when Newberg scanned these brains of nuns and Buddhists, undergoing these mystical experiences, they reported these feelings of timelessness, spacelessness, and self-transcendence, right? He saw that reduced activity in the parietal lobes, as I mentioned before, the area that's responsible for these three-dimensional, perceiving like things, in space, these objects, right? And at this point, this meditator is experiencing a sense of oneness with all living things. In this case, the oneness with the tree, the mother, unity, because of the reduced activity, that blurs the perceived lines between the meditator and other objects, right? But it's not blurring. What it is, for them, I think, is enlightening. It's opening up a space, right? Different way to see it as an Indigenous person. Same thing happening here in one of our earth lodges. This man, his brain waves are changing. The language center, as you see on the right side, is more activated as they sing the songs. This part of the brain on the left side here is what the insula is activated. The insula is part of our brain that helps us, with conflict. Let me go past this slide here and get into resilience. The last slide I have here is where does resilience come from? I argue in my work that all these things that I've been talking about, and there are more, I didn't have a chance to go through them real thoroughly because of time, but all these things began to build cognitive resilience in the brain and what they call the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, the VMPFC. It's our ability to overcome negative effects on stress, on cognitive function. So back in the day when our ancestors didn't have enough food, they didn't have enough water, climate change was upon them. What did they do? They had to deal with, a hormetic stress. Their cells got stronger. They got stronger. They developed a resilient coping in their brain, right? However, rites of passage were used to prepare successive generations all the time to deal with high levels of stress and uncertainty, failed crops, not enough food, not enough game, just limitations of water, maybe warring with other, tribes, or, just inclement weather. So people were trained like that all the time. Young people were trained like that all the time. That doesn't happen much anymore. That's all part of the contemplative practices of Indigenous people. What we know about this last slide, we know that the location of it is in the, prefrontal cortex on the underside of the brain in all mammals. And it's really important in terms of processing healthy risk and fear, right? Yeah, we don't get so fearful. We take good risks, our brain's able to kind of, analyze fear, and it also plays a role in inhibition of emotional responses. We become more stoic and we have more of our emotions under control. our decision-making and self-control gets better. And the last one is that when this active coping is going on and the VMPFC is activated, the cognitive evaluation of morality gets higher. We care for one another. We care for the trees. We care for the planet. We care for all sentient beings. And that's the end of my slideshow.
Thank you so much, Michael. So I'm replacing Nicholas now. I'm Julieta, the Deputy Director of the Center. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, okay, good, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for your talk. Really interesting. I do have a lot of questions. And so while we wait for people to think about the questions, I'll just answer a quick one here, and I may ask you a question as well. So there's someone saying that this was a fantastic summary of information. So they would like some recommendations on specific readings, and also they're asking whether they get the slides. So the recording will be there for sure. And it depends on Michael whether you're happy to share the slides too. And also if you have any specific reading you would like to mention now as well.
Yeah, the slides can be shared. It's part of a book I'm working on, but the slides can be shared. I know you have a copy of the slides, so it's fine to share those. I just ask people to kind of be careful about how you share them, because some of these I've been given permission to share slides, like some of the brain images and stuff, and some of them I'm still seeking permission on some of them. So, but
yeah, no problem. We can also just share some of the slides, so we can talk about this offline later on if you would like to share some of them and not all of them. Yeah, right. Okay.
And any resources are, a lot of times I leave the citation in the slide, each slide. So
great. Okay. So, okay. I was going to ask you something, but I'll prioritize Renee. She's also congratulating you for the presentation, and she would like to know if you know whether there has been much work done with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders of Australia and the benefit of traditional practices to their health and well-being.
I have limited knowledge about that. I know a little bit. I know some things have been done. I'm not sure. I haven't jumped in. Haven't done a deep dive into that literature yet. But I know that those conversations are constantly happening. So I'm not sure what's all been sort of coalesced together. For mainstream consumption, public consumption. So.
Yeah, there's clearly there's been a lot of interest, and also there's another person asking whether you can recommend any books relating to what has been talked about today.
Oh gosh, I would read anything by Andrew Newberg. Andrew Newberg, he's a he does a lot of neurotheology. Books by there's a book called Altered Traits. I didn't have it in this presentation, but book called Altered Traits by Daniel Goleman and Richard Davidson is an interesting book about the brain. A lot of this stuff is original stuff that I put here together. If you look at just any of when they get the slides, just look at the things on the titles. Like if you're talking about telomeres, just read about telomeres. Let's see. Yeah, so that's about what I can give you right now.
So Joseph is wanting to share that they're currently working in remote Australia, and that they are of Indigenous descent, and that they found this to be really great to teach other clinicians about and follow the context of, because this follows the context of Indigenous Australia. And I must say, I'm originally from Argentina, and I also find that there are a lot of links with the situation there. So my question is around beliefs. So as you were presenting all these Indigenous contemplative practices, I was wondering what your thoughts are about the role of beliefs, and whether if beliefs change in these communities, particularly with new generations, where there is, you think there will be a change in the effects and the way these contemplative practices are experienced, or whether they are fairly independent.
Yeah, I think that of course there are changes in beliefs, which doesn't necessarily mean that's going to change a person's genetics or change a person's neurobiology. I think that's the thing, is that we need to understand that a bit more. I know that there are different kinds of just one part of the toolbox of understanding human behavior is to understand what we've inherited, in terms of our neurobiology, our biology, our genes, those kinds of things. It's pretty clear that in some fields that, when you get a couple of copies of a particular kind of gene, let's say a COMT gene, COMT gene, they call the worrier gene. If you get a particular copy of that, that particular gene, let's say you get 2 CC variants of that particular gene, you could be quite the warrior, like my mother was, right? If you get a copy of a C and a T in that particular variant, you could be a warrior and a worrier. So I'm worried about this, but I'm still a warrior, right? Kind of, that's how I am. So my dad was probably a worrier and a warrior. So I got one of his worry genes and got one of my mom's warrior genes. So how does that affect beliefs? Well, I think how we feel about things, right? Whether or not we feel resilient, whether or not we feel like we can walk through fire, whether or not we feel like we can rise and be resilient towards those kinds of things, aren't always a question of environment. They are many times, don't get me wrong, but it's a question sometimes that the research shows that there are kids that they call dandelion kids, tough kids. They just don't break very easily. They go to residential schools or boarding schools, they go through trauma and they come out of it and they like, okay, I'm done with that, right? And they can go on and on. They're like here it's a dandelion. You take the dandelion out, it's back next year. You have to napalm them, dig them up, and burn them. They still come back, right? That's what the dandelion kid. There are other kids that they call tulip kids. Orchid kids. Very delicate, very intelligent, very smart, or very, just very, very artistic and so on, but just very sensitive. So we're looking at sensitivity. So beliefs can also be based upon the person's level of sensitivity, right? And if you're an orchid kid, you're more vulnerable to suicide and anxiety disorders. Creative and intelligent and and very, very purposeful in life, and so on. That's very important to remember, that kids, have that kind of span. We get, as I said, we get some of that from mom, we get some of that from dad. If you've got 2 tough parents that made it through, chances are your belief system is going to be like, I can do this, right? If you're vulnerable another way, your belief system, may wax and wane, you may change, shape shift and those kinds of things. So beliefs do change. They don't only change with the environment, they change according to what we call epigenetics. When you go into a different environment, even though you may be an orchid child that's very vulnerable and sensitive, if you go in the right environment, but there's a lot of love and support, your belief system will change that, I can make it, I can do it, and so on. So there's a lot of factors there. It's not an easy question to answer, but it's a good question. So.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, and the questions are coming in. So one of our listeners is asking whether you're aware of any research demonstrating the impact of these contemplative practices in the restoration of telomere length.
Oh yeah, yeah. There are. I don't cite it in this particular study, but yeah, there's and this your presentation, but yeah, there's a lot of evidence now kind of emerging that even reducing stress, even running, like I said earlier, even if you run, and let's say if you run and you're a contemplative runner and you don't think about all the problems when you run, but you just think about how your body's moving and your feet touching and you're just kind of in the moment, right? Those kinds of things kind of double up and they increase your sense of well-being, probably increasing your telomere length too, much more. But yeah, so yeah, there are studies about when you say contemplative, it could be all kinds of things. If you're just doing sitting meditation, of course, yeah, a lot of big benefits from it. So
yeah, there are different ways of moving, right? Not all the movement is contemplative, and vice versa. Not every contemplative practice implies movement. Yeah,
and that's why yoga has become so popular. And those kinds of these kind of very, very contemplative movements. Yeah.
Yeah. There's someone here saying, well, they're teaching meditation classes with Indigenous women. So they're asking if you have any recommendations about how best to incorporate your work and your findings into specific meditation practices.
Well, I think, when you're incorporating, meditation, it's really important to think about beyond the cushion. So I say beyond the cushion, sitting there and doing sitting meditation. There's a lot of meditation. There's things as simple as like they call mindful eating, mindful listening, open mind to all the sounds, but also mindful, walking, mindful swimming, running, all those kinds of things. So I always think it's best, for most people, just to start very slow. And maybe for some people, it's very difficult. It's very, they may have, almost to use the approach. And so for me, that's, people maybe not closing their eyes. Maybe they're just going to walk carefully with people and just focus on their breath as they walk or that sort of thing. So different kinds of ways to do it, but you're all these different kinds of things. I mean, I practice dreaming and going to sleep and meditating in my dreams. It's taken a while to kind of get to the point where you have this lucid dream where you wake up and say, oh, I'm dreaming, right? And you're really dreaming. So your consciousness is part there, but then you'll say, okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go sit in my dream. I'm going to meditate, see how that feels, and you can do it, and that's the thing, is that there are all different kinds of ways to kind of incorporate that. What I do know is that, meditation, from this book, Altered Traits, and from a lot of study that's going on, when you reach 100 hours of meditation, hour a day for 100 days, or half an hour a day for 200 days, or whatever it is, right? You begin to build white matter, myelin sheath in the brain. It helps with connectivity, right? You begin to become more emotionally regulated. You move to like 1,000 hours. That begins to become even more powerful. You start to kind of see some changes then, in your telomeres and things like that. When you reach 5,000 hours, you start to find some really dynamic things happening. Your part of the brain that is like the me part of the brain begins to shift and change. It becomes the we part of it becomes we. Then you begin to lose a sense of, who I am totally, as an individual, but I'm connected to things, right? When you reach 10,000 hours, then you're really beyond that. You're just like, wow, I'm connected. I'm so connected to, all the things and people around me, that sort of thing. So it's these dynamic changes are happening. And of course, when you get to that 10,000 hour mark, which is very difficult to get to, even over a lifetime, but people do it by meditating a lot, like many hours a day for years, sometimes on these retreats. Like I said, these really dynamic things begin to happen. And it's not just sitting on a cushion when you're meditating. It's like when you're every moment you're moving around, you're staying in a focused moment. When you're driving a car, you're not looking at the drivers who cut you off or cussing at somebody, or like, I got to get home for dinner, those kinds of things. You're in the moment, right? And that's the thing, is that most of the research finds out that the magic begins to happen. These transcendent experiences begin to happen when you silence the chatter in the brain and the talk, and you're in that moment, right? And this is kind of what, a lot of the contemplatives all over the world have found out, is that the deep contemplative practice that a person does then brings them to this spot where that chatter and those kinds of things just drift through, and they're in this different space altogether. So I know it's kind of beyond what the question was asked, but it's kind of like this stages that, you go through, if you're interested in that too as well. So.
Thank you. So an anonymous attendee says, thank you for an excellent presentation. You referenced your grandchildren earlier. How has your research translated into your own parenting practices? Have you observed any examples of resilience building in younger generations?
Oh, yeah. Well, the first slide were my daughters. And, my oldest daughter is 16. My second youngest daughter is 10, and my youngest daughter is 6. So, and I've got grown sons. So I've got 2 families, right? So I've seen my oldest sons are meditators, and my younger daughters. And so the biggest thing that I've seen is emotional regulation with kids. Like the youngest daughter, when she starts to freak out, sometimes I'll say, breathe. And she just takes a big breath. Take another one. And then she's kind of back to ground zero again, right? Not always, but she's working on it, right? And she started a little bit late. But I think that's the thing, is that emotional regulation is such a key thing for kids. We know that, when kids are 2 years old, that when we introduce meditation to them, and I'm talking about sitting meditation now, and they just learn how to sit on the cushion and be quiet and focus on their breath, they begin to change, their ability and their executive function, which means they get better at delaying gratification. I want this, I want this, I want this. That goes down, I can't pay attention. There's too many things going on. That goes down. They begin to focus better, and their cognitive flexibility gets better. They're able to move one thing to the next thing, to the next thing. So that really, is helpful for kids. So start them early and start them, simple, but do it. And when parents do it, when, teachers do it, when older folks do it with kids, they catch on right away. That's the most important thing to remember.
So another question related to the younger generation. Do you think that they have increased anxiety due to not really connecting to nature and culture?
Yeah, unfortunately, I believe that that's what the research looks like. Levels of anxiety have shot up. And I think it's because, there are all these things that are competing for the brains of the kids and the attention of kids, whether it's TikTok or whether it's YouTube or whether it's, these social media platforms, those kinds of things, can really, really sort of draw kids in, and they lose connection. But that didn't just start now. I was telling someone the other day, I said, I remember that in the 90s, when in the United States, when I was a PhD student, I was walking down, the street one day, and I was looking at some of these shops. And in these shops, they were making these cassette tapes. And most of you probably don't even know what a cassette tape is these days, but cassette tape, when they were putting the sounds of streams and the sounds of birds on there and the sounds of the ocean, on there. So people would listen to those with headphones on to get the sense of relaxation. It sounded like a great idea, but people had anxiety. But what happened, I think, was that people no longer went to the waters. They no longer went outside to listen to they no longer went to the ocean. And they didn't see what was happening to those places they love to be, or they need to be, that all this refuse and junk and these things are being, polluted, or they were being plowed down, and, some supermarket was being built there or something, right? So I think that was a big part of it that was happening, that really, again, has brought us to this point now where the anxiety is quite high. We see that among kids, especially after the pandemic, during the pandemic. But it can change very rapidly. I work with a group that does a lot of work around taking kids into the environment. Some of the work that I do has in the curriculum I've written about for Indigenous kids on my reservation, my treaty territory, is where kids are go out into the lands and they do meditations on the lands. They touch the earth, they smell the soil, they taste the rain, all those different kinds of things. And they don't do it just for a weekend workshop. We try to get them to do it all the time, right? And that's what's important about it, is reconnecting. So important. Land-based education is such an important thing these days.
Yeah, it's become harder to do it, but still possible in some contexts. You did mention your model of mindful decolonization. And so I was wondering, the cleansing stage where you talked about realizing the effects of colonization, and I think you talked about it at an individual level, but I was wondering if you think there's a role there for conversation and a social cleansing situation where you realize things by actually talking to each other.
Yeah. I do, and one of the things I did when I first came here as a dean to my current job is I start working on a center for mindful decolonization and truth and reconciliation, where you would get Indigenous people to sit with settlers to, to do meditative practices, to have this contemplative time together, and then to begin to build, a sense of compassion, a sense of understanding. Sometimes this happens when people get together and they have these discussions and talks and they really listen to each other. Happens once or twice, maybe 4 or 5 times a year, maybe 10 times a year. But what the difference is with this center that I was trying to do is it happens all the time until you begin to actually, forge changes in the neural pathways in the brain, and you start to develop this larger sense of connection with one another, which we know happens, when you reach so many hours of practice. So that we know that, there's a formula for that. When you reach so many hours of practice, that you should be turning the curve on understanding and compassion and cooperation and those kinds of things. So we've got, science behind that shows if you can bring people together that do this kind of thing in reconciliation and truth, that compassion and cooperation should arise from that after so many hours of practice. And of course, the practice is like the cleaning part is to kind of face what that is, and then to kind of understand it, to focus on it, to, analyze it in a way that you say, what is it doing to me as an individual? What is it doing to the people that I love? What is it doing to the people that I don't know, but potentially have this love and this community I can build with them, right? So I think that's a big part of it, that it can be done, I think, at that community level. And that's why I worked on, I didn't get it off the ground since I've been here. It's kind of gotten off the ground, but not as much. The pandemic kind of killed it. But the Center for Mindful Decolonisation and Truth and Reconciliation, which is between settlers and Indigenous peoples. So a lot of potential, I think. So
yeah. And when you talked about the Renaissance, I think, phase, you talked about creativity and new practices and new technologies. And I was curious about that. If you could talk a little bit more about it and give a few examples.
Yeah, so I was thinking that's actually in the Enlightenment phase.
Oh yeah, okay, sorry.
Yeah, so the Enlightenment phase, where how can we use artificial intelligence, for example, right? A lot of people see the artificial intelligence as the boogeyman, and it can be. There's a lot of bad stuff that the artificial intelligence will draw for to come up with solution to a problem or whatever it is. It can, what exists out there is it collects from the things that human beings have put out there, and it's collecting that data. How about if we were to steer that, artificial intelligence and machine learning in compassionate ways, and I think that's possible. Imagine I talked with PhD students last year about this, and they kind of wrinkled their nose at me, but that's fine. I said, imagine if you could get an Indigenous grandmother and you could build an avatar of this beautiful Indigenous grandmother with long braids and this beautiful face and this wisdom, who could sit there and look at you and kind of read you, right? And could read your body language, the number of times you blink your eye when you're answering, and your head and moving forward. And it's, running these algorithms so it gets to know you intimately well, right? Remember, it's, I know it kind of sounds creepy to some people. It's like, oh, that sounds creepy. But imagine that this machine, though, this avatar never got tired. It didn't get bored with your story. It knew the right words to say at the right moment, the right cues to give, the empathy, and it didn't fall asleep or look at its cell phone while you were talking, right? But it was deeply engaged with you. Just like when a person engages with someone who is on the other end of a suicide line, right? You build that capacity, and this machine, has that capacity to really, really engage you at this very deep level. I think that's a possibility, and I think that's creativity. So some, whiz kid is going to go hopefully and do that. I'm working with some young women here in Canada who are from Montreal and also in Toronto, and they've contacted me because I've got some stuff on the web that they want to do, and they want to do something similar to that, where they can have a machine learning that does mental health work with people out in communities and Indigenous people and rural people. So I'm kind of working with them on that. I said, to kind of develop, to put the right information into it, the right cues, and so on. And their machine then will kind of have the algorithm. So every time it meets you, it'll get better and better at understanding what your needs are, you know, and at some point in the future, you know, these things are going to be able to pick up on pheromones. When you come in, it'll smell your fear, maybe touch you, it'll know your body temperature, read your body temperature. I know it sounds kind of like, you know, an Arnold Schwarzenegger, you know, Terminator movie, but it's really true that, you know, those capacities exist. And if we can use them for good, you know, if we can use them to build compassion and humanity and you know, peace and justice and those kinds of things, and help change and shift, you know, the paradigm, I think, you know, I think that's going to be, you know, an important thing to think about in the age of enlightenment. So it can be darkness or enlightenment. I vote for enlightenment. So
Yeah, certainly. Okay, Michael, we need to wrap up, but thank you so much for your presentation, and also thank you to the audience for joining us, and just reminding people to subscribe to our newsletter to stay informed about other upcoming events. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
thank you, everyone.